Hi, and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know. Spring Break Edition! Anyway, we are on spring break.
Anyway,
we're just moving on from that right away.
Coming at you live from
Austin
Beach.
Okay,
no,
great.
Coming at you live from South by Southwest.
Wow! I guess that is technically
that's
true.
actually true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
We're no way affiliated with South by Southwest.
You don't have to clarify that.
And we are now. Oh, look, we just got an email with a cease and desist from South by Southwest. No, just kidding. But yes, it is spring break. We are here. We are casting pods with you. We are Classical Stuff You Should Know, a podcast about the classical world, ancient things, and we're not trying to rediscover a golden age of education, but we're trying to think about what makes education timeless, about the human soul, and how human beings have not drastically changed from 3,000 years ago till now, that our hearts are still the same, we all desire the same things, and there is a way to grow up the child into honorable manhood and womanhood. And that is what we like to explore and talk about and think about.
Man, what a pitch, Donald.
I know,
Great.
isn't that nice?
That was a super good intro.
Can you
Thank
record
you.
that and just do that every time?
Okay, well, it starts with...
Except for that part, actually. Yeah, if you could just remove that part.
And Megby, I think you are taking the reins on this one. What are we going to learn today?
As with most episodes, I kind of have no idea, but we'll see where we end up. So our starting place for today is a little book called... It's a preface to Paradise Lost. I think this was... before it was its own separate book, it was like literally a preface to Paradise Lost.
That was at the beginning of
Paradise Lost, and then was
a very
separate.
large edition of it, obviously.
Yeah. So this is Paradise Lost. Just hearing Graham and AJ talk about it feels like one of those books that I ought to, in fact, read. So I'm working my way up to that. So I think on AJ's suggestion, he said to read the preface before reading Paradise Lost itself, which makes sense. It is a preface. So this is my first time through it. This is a book you all have read before, correct?
Yeah, it's by C.S. Lewis for those who are listening.
And
Yeah.
it's
really good.
one of the backbones of how I teach the book in class. A lot of what you've heard me talk about on the podcast about Paradise Lost is the ideas were started by that book and then sort of expanded on by just me talking about it in class and having kids say stuff, and I go, oh, that's smart.
I've done seminars on stuff from that book that have nothing to do with Paradise Lost.
Say more about that.
There's so much content in there that
Yes.
isn't just how to read and understand Paradise Lost.
Totally.
There's a ton about
Epic poetry.
Poetry and virtue, and how she'd read classics, and how we should accept the book, and how the theology of Milton interacts with the theology of today. It's really good.
Yeah, it is really good. I've only just started reading it, and it's my first time through it. What surprised me is how it's not really talking about Dante, how it's not really talking about Milton or Paradise Lost yet. It's setting the stage with like different types of epic before it gets into Paradise Lost. So that was a surprising thing to me. And I think one of you had said that maybe the drier parts of this book are the earlier sections of it.
The first two chapters about primary and secondary epic are just kind of boring if
Yes.
you're not interested in that sort of thing, but it does get better.
Yeah, because you all had both read Paradise Lost before coming to the preface, correct?
I can't remember.
My history was I read Paradise Lost a little bit in a poetry class in college, and then got a job here many years later, and they're like, "Hey, can you teach Paradise Lost?" And I said, "Of course I can." Yeah. And I'm like, "I don't think I've ever read this all the way through." And then I read that preface and then taught the class.
And then taught the class after that. Okay, all that makes sense.
7 years later, still love Milton.
Good. That's high praise. So just to say, listener, I will, of course, encourage you to pick up a copy of the preface to Paradise Lost, but you might have the same experience I do of saying, he's not talking about Paradise Lost very much, and he has to set the stage before he can get into the book itself. There's a context. He has this really interesting idea of like, Milton chose this specific form of epic for a reason, and that's kind of what he's going through in the first few chapters. So it's interesting, but I have no context having never read Paradise Lost. So I'll just say that. So the chapter we'll start with today is actually the second chapter. So AJ is talking about he's talking through this difference of primary and secondary epic, but we're going to talk about this chapter, Is Criticism Possible?, which is a digression from his like main argument. So we're not really going to be talking about Paradise Lost. Sorry, listener. So here's the quote from the beginning of the chapter, and we'll go from there. The title of the chapter is Criticism Possible? But first, a necessary digression. A recent remark of Mr. Eliot's poses for us at the outset the fundamental question whether we, mere critics, have any right to talk about Milton at all. Mr. Eliot says bluntly and frankly that the best contemporary practicing poets are the only jury of judgment whose verdict on his own views of Paradise Lost he will accept. He goes on. So the only people who can say whether Paradise Lost is good or not is contemporary poets. So like good poets can say whether Milton is good or not.
This is Lewis's claim or what Eliot's?
This is Eliot's claim. This is Eliot's claim, which, to spoil, Lewis will eventually refute, or very quickly refute. So just hearing Eliot's stance, what do you have to say to that?
So let me see if I can break this down a little bit. So Eliot says the people who know how to criticize the game are people who've played the game at a high level.
Yes.
Whereas Lewis says you can have never played the game, but you can be a student of the game and know a lot about the game and therefore criticize the game. Is that
kind of? I guess I'm spoiling all the conversation, but I don't think Lewis ends up giving very satisfactory criteria for who gets to say whether Paradise Lost is good or not. But he does say that it's insufficient to say that only modern, let me get the right phrase, the best contemporary practicing poets. He doesn't think that those are the only people who get to be the jury of judgment for Paradise Lost.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the same, you hear that argument in like sports writing, right? Like, or commentators. Do you want to, like, are people who've never played hockey, can they write about hockey and talk about hockey and be critical about hockey? For you guys from Texas, so hockey is a game that is played on a frozen surface of ice.
Wait, what? Really? That's weird. Why would anyone do that? It sounds boring.
I don't know.
How would you get the ball through the hoop?
Yeah, exactly. I don't understand.
You flatten the ball, you freeze it, and it's made of galvanized rubber. I think I disagree with Eliot. I think I have to because I teach the book and talk about the book.
And you yourself are not
I myself am not a high-level epic poet.
I've read some of your emails. They're pretty good.
they get up there.
They get super long.
You do write wonderful toasts. Like you write poetry during meetings.
Sure, but those are jokes.
Yeah, but they're also wonderful. So,
and that's because I'm like I should be paying attention to the meeting.
But I end up writing a poem.
Writing little poems about the meeting.
Feels okay. AJ, what say you? So Eliot stands on one side and says that only the best contemporary practicing poets can be the jury of judgment for Paradise Lost, and Lewis says, nah. And I'll give Lewis his arguments in a second after this, but what say ye?
Oh, man. I mean, I guess I'm still sort of developing my notions about what I believe about this.
Good for you.
But here's where I'm kind of landing right now. Only those who have a developed understanding of a thing can best criticize whether a thing is good or not.
Yes.
But whether a thing is good or not should also be recognizable, at least at a low level, by those who enjoy it. And it depends on the thing, right? So let's say wine, right? So I don't really like wine. I'm not a huge wine guy, but I can have wine and I can say this tastes kind of good or this tastes kind of bad, but a sommelier is going to be better able to tell me whether something is fantastic or not. But wine is something that you kind of have to have a developed palate for, right? It's not for everybody. But there are certain things that are supposed to be entertainment, right? And if I have to be a professional actor to enjoy a certain movie, that movie is failing, right? It is designed to entertain the masses. And if it's not entertaining the masses, it's doing it wrong, right? So as far as poetry goes, I guess it depends on who it's aimed at, right? If I'm talking Instagram poetry, well, that's aimed at the masses. If I don't get it, there's probably something wrong there.
Is that a thing?
Oh my goodness,
yeah.
is
it really?
poetry
Oh,
thing?
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just take like a common sentence, like I saw you walking down the street, but take away all capital letters, and then
Put it in a serifed font that looks like a typewriter.
Put it in a serif font. Put it, and then obviously it's a digital photo, but make it look like it's typewritten.
Then have like a black and white sort of curly drawing around the edges or something.
And then just do line breaks at weird spots. So it's, I saw you walking down the street. And then everyone's just like, oh my goodness.
Which sounds horrible. So I still have the Twitter. It's private, so no one try and look it up. But all of my tweets were haiku. So maybe I was like the proto this person. Neither of you all are following me, so neither
Seriously?
of you have actually. Yeah, 100%.
You have only haiku Twitter?
And each one, yeah. Anyway, so that's a thing. So when I Google Instagram poetry, the first thing that comes up is an Atlantic article that I hope the title of makes you very sad. How Instagram saved poetry. So there you go. Yeah, great. Okay,
yeah,
so there you go. So I think it's a fine distinction to say that there are different goals, different types of media or entertainment. And so, yeah, something aimed at the masses. The mass, like, that means anyone could say whether it's good or not.
Actually, bad Instagram poetry has inspired me to write
better?
poetry. Actually, I wasn't even planning on talking about it, but I sort of have the book right here. I'm giving myself a little like spring break and also sort of life task, and that is I'm trying to find as many different wacky poetic forms that there are. And do you know who has the most wacky poetic forms?
The Dutch?
The Welsh.
Really?
Oh, it's
Yes.
close.
So for example, I'm just checking. I'm writing out all the different kinds of poetic forms that I can find. So like I can't even pronounce it. A phraseliche.
What?
It's Welsh. And anyway, so I'm getting all these different poetic forms. I'm writing them down in this little book, and then I'm going to try to write one poem in that form.
Okay.
As many times as I can. So like if I have 30 forms, I'll write 30 poems, then I'll go back to the beginning and try it again, because the free form crappy Instagram poetry just is so annoying. I was like, surely you can, and also this idea of, so I'm not a poet. I'm not very good at writing poetry. I don't even think I'm all that good with like finding words and metaphors. But I have the belief as a classical educator that by practicing and copying, so in this case, copying forms and going and reading good poems in these forms, and by copying them and trying to like do what other people who are writing in these forms do, you get better at it, and hopefully you can kind of get to the point where something is more competent.
You're apprenticing yourself.
Yeah, similar to like if you were copying the masters in painting.
Yes,
right.
And my hope is that if I do that, then I could create something that I'm satisfied with, so that every time I read Instagram poetry, I'm not sort of horribly
Sickened
depressed
and
over
saddened.
just sort of how vapid and sort of shallow everything is.
Yeah.
Anyway,
So if we're talking Milton,
yeah.
I think Milton is designed to be something that a layperson can read and
Right.
find enjoyment.
Yeah.
But then but more layers are discovered as you study it deeply, right? There's more to be found.
Yeah.
Right. It's a good movie where there's symbolism, and if you want to study it, you can. And if you don't want to study it, you can read it once and enjoy it. And that's
But it's good at both levels.
right. And isn't that supposed to be the mark of a classic? That on the second read, you learn more, and you can keep on reading it, and it keeps on giving you more. And that's the mark of a good book.
Presence of depth. Yeah.
Yeah.
All this, so just to wrap up on Instagram poetry, you all have probably heard this before. Robert Frost has a wonderful quote. Free verse is like playing tennis without a net.
Yeah.
So good. So Instagram.
That actually sounds like a really fun game.
Yes.
Why
but
is playing
also-
tennis without a net terrible? It sounds great.
Why bother? It feels like, right?
Well, then you're just playing racquetball, essentially,
Okay,
right?
good. Yeah. All right. So were you going to say something else?
Well,
Graham?
it was just so in English class, we read a lot of Paradise Lost out loud. Or sorry, I read a lot of Paradise Lost out loud while we're teaching it. And Paradise Lost has lots of those that were sort of popular when Milton wrote it, a lot of those digressions, where when he digresses and he's like, you know what this reminds me of? It's kind of like this. It's kind of like this old Greek army. No, it's not like that old Greek army. It's like this Norwegian Viking. No, you know what it's really like? It's like a Norwegian Viking ship that got beached on a stranded whale. And then, anyway, Satan. So there's a lot of these digressions, and when students try to read it at home, they're like, oh my goodness, I have no idea what he's talking about. But I found that when you read it out loud, students sort of realize when you're digressing, and if you as a good reader are reading it and you have the emphasis and you have in the right places and the characters are speaking, that a untutored in Milton 15-year-old can sit and listen and get and enjoy it or understand what is happening in the scene. Maybe it's harder for them to read it themselves, but just by listening it, they can get it. And hopefully it is left an impression on them that like, oh my goodness, there's so much here if I wanted to go into it, but I can also just kind of enjoy the fact that these demons are talking to each other in hell. And that's sort of already kind of interesting. So I think that's almost like it has enough for the masses, but also has like all this depth, like a good movie or so I don't know if I don't agree with Elliot where the only way to assess whether something is good or bad is if you yourself are a poet. I mean, Elliot's saying that because he's
a poet.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, like for take example, I know we're still digressing here, but The Shawshank Redemption, right? If you
I've
haven't
never seen it.
You're missing out.
I know.
It is a great movie. It's about a guy who ends up in jail and then eventually escapes, and how all that happens. And it's really enjoyable on a first watch. It's got Morgan Freeman. He narrates the whole thing as he should. But if you want to go deeper, you can and see how they use lighting to events. Like when it's actually warm sunlight, that's when he's feeling most human. And when he's in jail and feeling inhuman. It's these dark, overcast days. So like the basic way that they frame every shot and do all the cinematography, well, if you're a cinematographer, you're going to appreciate it. But if you're a random person in the audience and just watch the movie, it's also still good.
Yeah, I like that. So let's go through Lewis's argument, and then we'll go on to our next writer who has some thoughts on this. So Lewis takes this more from a logical perspective. So again, Eliot is saying only the best contemporary practicing poets can be the jury of judgment for Paradise Lost. So, Lewis says, let us consider what would follow if we took Mr. Eliot's view seriously. The first result is that I, not being one of the best contemporary poets, cannot judge Mr. Eliot's criticism at all. What then shall I do? Shall I go to the best contemporary poets who can and ask them whether Mr. Eliot is right? But in order to go to them, I must first know who they are, and this, by hypothesis, I cannot find out. The same lack of poethood which renders my critical opinions on Milton worthless renders my opinions on Mr. Pound or Mr. Auden equally worthless. Shall I then go to Mr. Eliot and ask him to tell me who the best contemporary poets are? But this, again, will be useless. I personally may think Mr. Eliot a poet. In fact, I do. But then, as he has explained to me, my thoughts on such a point are worthless. I cannot find out whether Mr. Eliot is a poet or not, and until I have found out, I cannot know whether his testimony to the poethood of Mr. Pound or Mr. Auden is valid. Isn't that funny?
It is funny.
I like that. And then at the basis of this, of his whole critical edifice, then lies the judgment, I am a poet. But this is a critical judgment. It therefore follows that when Mr. Eliot asks himself, am I a poet? He has to assume the answer, I am, before he can find the answer, I am. And that's, so fundamentally, it's a logical point he makes, that we can't know who these great poets are, and so we can't use that as a criteria.
Yeah, if your judgment's taken out of it, you have to trust the judgment of those that you cannot judge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, he takes it more from a logical perspective, but what you all are getting at is something more fundamental and I think is important. So I was going to go in a different order, but based on what y'all are saying, let's go to Leo Tolstoy. Who is Leo Tolstoy? What do y'all know about this fella?
He's Russian.
Russian.
Was he... What did he write? Didn't he write The Death
Karenina.
of Ivan Ilyich?
War and Peace.
War and Peace, Anna Karenina. The Death of Ivan Ilyich. I don't know about that.
Yes, The Death of Ivan Ilyich.
I have only ever read How Much Land Does One Man Need, or something like that. That little short story. You read that short story. I've never read it.
How Much Land Does One Man
No,
Need?
I didn't read it. I'm getting him confused with Dostoevsky.
Exactly. That's Russian, right?
Is the trouble.
Yeah.
Was he was the guy that sort of invited a whole bunch of dudes to sort of live at his house, and his wife didn't like it, and he...
That sounds right. That also sounds
that's
like
him?
the story of The Death of Ivan Ilyich, isn't it?
died at a train station? Or am I thinking
That's-
Dostoevsky?
Died at a train station was Anna Karenina.
Karenina, yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah,
Maybe also his
I'm
life.
getting all
Sure.
the Russian stuff mixed
A
up.
Russian author. That is what we're getting at here. So War and Peace and Anna Karenina are probably the most relevant to people listening, or the one you've probably heard of.
Hannenberg, you have a beautiful copy, a 3-volume set of War and Peace, the Everyman Library, on your shelf. And I must practice the Christian virtues because I covet it. And I mustn't.
Well, then practice that.
Then that 3-volume set is doing its job.
I know.
The job that I put it there for.
Well done.
I just covet all of those beautiful Everyman Library books.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I have a copy, it's coming in the mail, of Brideshead Revisited. Never read it. And I got the Everyman copy for like $8
cool.
used on Amazon. I'm super stoked. Sounds like a good book.
I think the Cersei Institute did a close reads series on Brideshead Revisited,
really?
so you might want to listen to that too, because it was pretty good. I was not reading it with them, but okay. So Tolstoy wrote a number of novels, short stories, number of things. Russian author, and he also wrote an essay that I find helpful, interesting, called "What Is Art?" Have you all read "What Is Art" before?
I have not read What Is Art.
Okay, so I feel like it coming from Tolstoy matters. I mean, he having created art might have some really interesting ideas on what is art.
Yep. School us, Magby. School us.
I'll give you a couple quotes and then we'll distill it from there. The business of art lies just in this: to make that understood and felt which, in the form of an argument, might be incomprehensible and inaccessible. The business of art lies just in this: to make that understood and felt which, in the form of an argument, might be incomprehensible and inaccessible.
So if I'm trying to say how I feel about a meadow at dusk, I can't argue you into understanding that.
Right.
It is best if I express it to you in some other form,
Sure.
like a painting or a song or something like that.
Yes.
Leaving, some sort of artifact that leaves that emotional impression, or leaves that not just an emotional impression, but leaves that impression of how something makes you feel and think, and reflecting on
the understanding of my complete experience of a meadow at dusk.
Perfect. Yes. Yeah.
So there is
that's a good. I like that.
Yeah,
that's a really good definition.
So you're talking to the like aesthetic aspect of it. So there are things of beauty that we can't experience purely through, bullet pointed arguments, but there's also an element of it. So yes, you feel something for beauty, but also there are like moral arguments that you wouldn't agree to if I just said, Graham, you should stop coveting that book over there. Mm-hmm. Instead, I can tell you a story about someone who coveted a book and then that book killed them, or something. I can make you feel that coveting is bad.
I now feel that way
just based on me giving you
of death.
The one sentence summary of my horrible book. So let's see. Art also
turns out the Everman Library use toxic glue, and the more you read their books, the more toxic glue.
I steal it, and I'm trying to read it on my car drive home, and I drop it, and it hits the accelerator, and I go flying off the bridge.
Oh my gosh! Y'all are writing the story for me right now. I hate this. So art is to evoke in oneself a feeling one has once experienced, and having evoked it oneself, that by means of movement, lines, colors, sounds, or forms expressed in words, so to transmit that feeling that others may experience the same feeling. That is the activity of art. So it is that you're trying to transmit something to someone else.
Right.
So feeling is one part of it, but Tolstoy keeps going back to art must be moral. So any art that is conveying an immoral teaching in a positive way is bad art, regardless of the beauty of the thing itself. So my boy, William Blake, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell would be bad art.
Whoa, he was moral?
He was making moral, I don't know, unless it was satire. And
well, William Blake?
Isn't that?
It was definitely moral.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. But he believed the things he was writing in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, he did.
And so even if you could say, oh, it's so beautifully written, the content of what is being written about matters to Tolstoy.
By saying, like, just be like licentious and...
yes.
Yeah.
What does he base that on?
Tolstoy's? What is Tolstoy?
His personal experience. So he
says to be good art, it has to be moral.
Well, remember, we posed this question to our seniors when we talked about the portrait of Dorian Gray. What was the question that we asked them to start the unit? Do you remember? It's the one that you and I really disagreed on. It was about like art and moral and what's good art. Do you blame art for the impression that it leaves on people?
Yeah. Do you blame is the artist culpable for his art? I think was the question.
Yeah.
No. The question is, can art itself be moral or immoral?
That's right.
So Tolstoy would say yes.
Tolstoy would say yes.
Because Oscar Wilde says no. A book is neither good nor bad. It is either well written or poorly written. It cannot be moral itself.
Yeah.
And I was taking the side of Oscar Wilde in that conversation.
And I disagree with that. I guess I take the side of Tolstoy and say that a book, a beautiful book that is immoral. Like, for example, I have tried twice in my life to read Lolita. Mm-hmm. Nabokov. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Sounds like Nabokov.
You think of someone who watches a lot of hockey would know how to pronounce Russian names.
Proud of you.
But anyway, I've twice in my life tried to read that book, and it's a book about like a 13-year-old girl's sexual encounters with a 40-year-old man lodging in her house, and it's every time I read it is just so dark and depressing that I can't. Even if I can't sort of distill any beauty from it because it's just so nasty. But there are people who say that this book is like, a important piece of literature, and for whatever reason, I just can't get over the fact that it just feels so like smutty.
Right.
Even there was like a book that someone was talking about. I think it was called "Reading Lolita in Tehran."
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I was just thinking about that as like a concept. And I think what they were saying was we take this book and we bring it to these women that are oppressed in this sort of oppressive regime, and we show them that, hey, through the power of literature, like you can liberate yourself from oppressive, patriarchy or whatever. And I mean, okay, that's maybe a fine concept, but Lolita, really, that's the book you're going to use?
Right.
I don't know. I feel like either I'm missing something or I just very much strongly agree with Tolstoy on this.
You want to say anything to the contrary?
It depends on how far you want to dive into this conversation.
It's relevant. Let me just say that. So Tolstoy does say that it matters the moral argument that the author is making in their work. The issue of beauty is separate, but you need both to have a work of art, essentially. You need both it to be conveyed well and a good thing to be conveyed. So I think it's relevant to the discussion.
The position I was taking in that conversation that I had with Donaldson is that, so Donaldson, you reacted negatively to that book. How do you know the author didn't write Lolita to give you those feelings, that no matter how much someone may glorify the sexual exploits of the young, it's smut, right? He wrote it to show you that no matter how much it might be beautified, you should have that reaction that you had, right? The book itself is not moral. Your reaction to the book is moral or immoral.
I mean, I've never finished it because both times I've read it, I've just sort of had to put it away for the health of my own soul just because it was so depressing.
Right. Even if at the end he says, the sexual liaisons of the young are a beautiful thing, maybe the author himself intended you to act in revulsion to that and then always hold an opinion otherwise.
But then what happens to those that are...
What about Paradise Lost, right? Some people react to Paradise Lost and say that Satan is the hero.
Yeah.
Right? In that sense, that would be an immoral book. But they're having a wrong reaction to the book itself, right?
Yeah, but then this comes down to criticism. So this comes down to... I'm not so much arguing authorial intent, but arguing, like, what does the book have in it that makes it up, that is advocating or not advocating a specific reading of that book. And I know that you and I differ on this, that I think that there are readings of things. And in fact, when we get to my podcast in a couple of episodes, when we're going to be talking about The Wasteland, anyway, we'll get to that. But I know that I have a stronger belief in the fact that there are canonical readings of things and then there are bad takes on things.
Oh, I'm
and
with
you're
you.
saying no, but you're saying that, like, if I'm understanding you correctly, that when I read Lolita and I say, let's not use Lolita because I've never finished it, so it's sort of a bad example. But if we use Paradise Lost and I say, no, Satan is not the hero, like, because he ends the book a laughable snake, and clearly what he's done is so terrible. And people say Satan's totally the hero because look how, like, awesome he is in book 1, and book 4 he's so, like, majestic and like a cover of a metal album, and he's just so cool. And I say, well, you're not taking the whole book into consideration. Like, we need to have a critical back and forth. But and at the end of that, I would say Milton is intending the view that I've come away with and the view that C.S. Lewis is talking about. Like, that was his intent. And the people who read this and say Satan's actually the hero and Milton is like an iconoclast, that's just a bad take. They're incorrect. And you're saying, no, how can you not know that Milton intended that?
No, I'm not arguing authorial intent. I'm saying that authorial intent aside, the book is an artifact, and how you react to that artifact makes you moral or immoral. The artifact is itself a thing. It's like a rock. Right, it's your reaction to that is moral or immoral.
No, the rock has been
and how you use
the rock has been crafted in a way that is going to have desired effects on human souls.
So there's the authorial intent.
Fine, but I mean, so we have an Elton John. You have an Elton John album on your wall, right?
Yeah.
And Elton John wrote, what album is it? Breaking Hearts. So Elton John wrote that album, and you write music because you want people to, like, listen to music and love the music and enjoy the music. So craft and care was put into it to have it be sonorous, to have it be melodies that are catchy and stick in your mind. And if you put in songs of like absolute dissonance or key changes that felt terrible, or beats that changed every measure so you couldn't keep up with it, like, you've now crafted an artifact that is uncomfortable to listen to. Now, if he did that, he would be doing that on purpose, and he could say, I've crafted this because I want you to feel uncomfortable, or I've crafted this because I want you to, because this is my sweet jams and I want you to enjoy it. I feel like the same is true when you're talking about immoral books. Like, if somebody is glorifying, the sexual exploits of the young, and everything in that book is made for its glorification, then I don't see how you can go around and say, but he's just doing that to make you think, he's just doing it to make you want to realize how gross it is. I don't know. That just feels like that's like someone who's making pornography says, like, but we're doing this just to, like, liberate human sexuality. And it's like, no, you're not. You're trying to make, making money and you're going to lowest common denominators, and no one believes that you're doing this to like benefit society.
I don't think pornography could
I'm just
most
saying,
certainly not called art.
Sure, or you write a shallow book and you say,
What's the difference
this is
between pornography? Well, didn't they say the difference between pornography and erotica is lighting? Isn't that the quote? Anyway.
So, for example, something that might illustrate my viewpoint. I once wrote a poem about Methuselah, right? And I put him in modern day. Methuselah lived a long time, 969 years, I think it was. And his dad, Methuselah's dad, was taken up by chariot into heaven, right? And so if I am a young boy and my father had been taken up into heaven, right? I think it was, I forget his dad's
Enoch.
name. Enoch. He was taken, and he was not because God took him, right? So if my dad was taken up by God and I'm hitting year 968, and I'm thinking, man, I'm still here. I've lived longer than anybody else I know ever. Maybe the same thing was supposed to happen to me and God forgot. And so in my poem, he spends a lot of time looking at things that represent time. So the rings of a redwood tree, and he can count them. And to him, it seems terrible. And then eventually he stops worrying about all these things. And he tries to, fill his time, and he messes with people, and he turns snarky young children into glassy-eyed philosophers, and he just does all kinds of weird stuff to fill his time because he has nothing else going on. At the end, he sort of resigns himself to God having forgotten about him. And he does all these things that represent him taking time away from himself. So he shaves his head, he shaves his beard, he cuts all of his fingernails, which all are records of time. And he looks at the tide going in and out because it's timeless, right? It's just a circular process. At the end of the poem, I have God come down as a mosquito and bow and drink Methuselah's blood as a reservoir of human experience because God didn't have the same experience yet. It was 1,000 years of human experience that God got to drink from, right? That is not a great representation of God.
Thank you. Good. Okay.
It's not, right?
Yeah.
This here is putting human experience above the Godhead and glorifying human experience perhaps above the divine.
So wouldn't you say that is a immoral poem?
No, I want you to think about it. That's all.
But it's bad.
It's not evil. I want you to think. This reaction you're having, it's bad to put a reservoir of human experience above the existence of God, is perhaps just the reaction I want.
But you wrote it thinking it was cool.
No, I wrote it thinking it was well written.
But you recognize that is a sentiment that you disagree with.
Yeah. I am allowed to, as an artist, espouse a sentiment I disagree with, in the hopes that you might disagree with it as well.
I'm going to move us on from here just to say that Tolstoy's view is not entirely agreed with, and actually our next author disagrees with Tolstoy. So just to offer... Yeah.
So that's why I didn't want to get into this. I knew it was going to be a long conversation.
In one that's not resolved, but I think it's helpful for the listener to hear that Tolstoy's position is not... So just to reflect on what we just experienced...
I can't believe we disagree so much on this.
Which is fine. But so Tolstoy put out this view that you thought you initially agreed with. Like, it sounds good when you first hear it.
Still sounds good.
Right. That art is about conveying something that can't be conveyed through argument.
Oh, I still like that part of it.
Yeah, exactly. But Tolstoy's entire view is that plus the morality of the piece itself, and that you are conveying a good thing. So in the way that you want to, we want to be more virtuous. We want to raise up children who are virtuous. We must expose them and ourselves to art that is both beautiful and conveys a moral message. That's Tolstoy's argument. But he has another piece of his argument that I haven't thrown out because I think you all will hate it, is that the art must also be universal. And what does he mean by universal? He means that universal, anyone can access it. What he's getting at is that things that are explicitly religious cannot be universal. So anything that is explicitly Christian, there's a certain cultural background you need to understand it. And so that cannot be good art if it is explicitly Christian. So one epic poem that is particularly relevant to our conversation today does not meet the Tolstoy test of good art. So Tolstoy's answer to whether Paradise Lost is good art is no, because it's too Christian, or because it is like explicitly Christian at all.
But wouldn't you say there's like timeless things in there? Like, I don't know, the relationship between law and grace, or law and free
anyone
will?
Can read and enjoy it, right?
Not everyone will understand all of it is a form of the argument. And so because there are like so he likes the ancients more than he likes the medievals. So things that are secular or a-religious, he finds more universal and accessible than religious art explicitly. That is his argument. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing.
Yeah.
That's his argument.
I think Milton's retort as a believer would be that everyone's a Christian, even if he doesn't want to be.
There you go. Okay, so a person who writes in opposition to Tolstoy's view is Harold Bloom, who I accidentally called Alan Bloom, or one or the other somewhat recently. Harold Bloom wrote a wonderful book called The Western Canon, which is too thick and too smart for me to have read entirely, so I just read sections of it. The intro is excellent, and his chapter on Shakespeare is incredible. Do y'all know anything? Didn't you read Harold Bloom somewhat recently? Was it like one of his essays or what? Do you remember?
I have Western Canon in my class. I've read it every now and then, chapters of it every now and then.
Yep. He loves Shakespeare. That's my one.
He does love Shakespeare. Yeah. He says Shakespeare invented the human.
Yeah. I'll read another funny quote about that later. Okay, so Harold Bloom reacts to Tolstoy's essay, What is Art? So this is quoting Harold Bloom. Palpably, Tolstoy's essay, like his What is Art, is a disaster, prompting the serious question of how so great a writer could have been so mistaken. Disapprovingly, Tolstoy quotes as idolaters of Shakespeare a distinguished company that includes Goethe, Shelley, Hugo, Turgenev, and he goes on. He could have included many others, indeed virtually every major writer capable of reading, with a few unsavory exceptions like Voltaire. The less interesting aspect, isn't that funny? I thought that was good. The less interesting aspect of Tolstoy's rebellion against the aesthetic is creative envy. There's a particular fury in Tolstoy's denial of an eminence shared by Shakespeare with Homer, a sharing that Tolstoy reserved for his own War and Peace, which is funny. Much more interesting is Tolstoy's spiritual revulsion against the immoral and irreligious tragedy of King Lear. I prefer such a revulsion to any attempts to Christianize Shakespeare's deliberately pre-Christian drama, and Tolstoy is quite accurate in saying that Shakespeare, as a dramatist, is neither a Christian nor a moralist. What is Art discards not only Shakespeare, but Dante, Beethoven, Raphael, and then he goes into Paradise Lost later. So Harold Bloom says this is a bad way of determining what is art. So where are we right now? T.S. Eliot says...
Only artists can do it. Only artists can criticize.
He says contemporary poet, eminent contemporary poets can do it now.
Well, you can't ask the dead ones.
That's exactly right. Yeah, they wrote it down, so there's that. So Eliot says that. Then Tolstoy says if it conveys a feeling, if it's a good moral feeling, and if it's universal, that is good art. Harold Bloom says, nah, Tolstoy, you're wrong. And his answer to how to figure it out is very similar to Eliot's. He has a quote from the intro. Greatness recognizes greatness and is shadowed by it. I love that quote. Without the canon, we cease to think. You may idealize endlessly about replacing aesthetic standards, yet only strength can join itself to strength. So a similar position to T.S. Eliot, but Bloom would not say that it's only contemporary poets. He would say that there is a canon, and to attach yourself to the canon, you must be great.
Yeah, that seems...
My question is, who gets to say? Doesn't he run into the same problem as Eliot?
There's a logical problem that Lewis is getting into, but I don't think the logic of it is Eliot's problem. I think, so when we say that we appeal to tradition, or Graham, what is the reason you were asked to read Paradise Lost? Is it because someone read it and said, oh, this is a really good book? Or is it we look at that time period and say, this is the most important book that comes out of it?
Yeah. It's the only thing I can think of is reputation. I think it's probably the most basic thing is, it's probably, Paradise Lost, that sounds familiar. We should probably read that. It's probably important. It is probably like at its most basic the way that it was talked about when the 10th grade curriculum was drafted. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, I'm trying to think of a book that I've never read. War and Peace. And I'm trying to think of like what's a book that's considered a classic that I myself personally have never read. Regardless, so pick a class. I've only read the Aeneid like once, mm-hmm. and just real fast. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, the Aeneid, there's probably gold there. There's probably like good things if I take the time to dig and find them. Or for example, we're expanding our curriculum for 12th grade to include a lot more Shakespeare plays. Kids are going to have choice. And I had never read, had been a long time since I read King Lear. I read King Lear a long time ago, and I just recently reread it. And as I was reading, I was like, there's really good stuff here. And if I spend even more time, you get these little hints that there's some deeper things going on in this book. And you're like, okay, if I just spent more time in this thing, I'm gonna uncover some really interesting, great metaphors or ways of expressing feeling that help me think about in King Lear's case, like how to be old, how to age, how to be responsible. So I think there's just like reputations, or when you read something and it's not immediately accessible to you, but you can see that there seems to be good stuff there. I think that's like a test. Now, I don't know. Wouldn't say that I'm great, and I'm definitely not a contemporary poet, but I feel like I can recognize when something has lots to give me. I just need to put the effort in. And when something is candy, or when you read it, you're like, oh, there's not tons here. Mm-hmm. There's not much here for me. I'm trying to think of like an example of something that I've read in the past that is old, that when I read, I was like, oh, there's not tons going on. Actually, Voltaire is maybe a good example. Like I remember reading Candide,
right,
and I'm like, oh, I get it. Like, I get your point.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a simple point, and it's like sort of expressed, and it's kind of clever, but
which is why Tolstoy likes it.
Which is why I get it.
Not a lot of deep soil to Candide.
Yep.
Or what was Rousseau and his his Happy Savage?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I can't remember what the book is. He's got a book about happy savages. I'm like, I get it, right? The savages are untouched by you have this anthropological theory that society is what corrupts you, and that man is happy when they're like naked and free in the woods. And you wrote a little book about it, and I get it. And that's all,
No, Fight Club did the same thing.
Whoop-de-doo. Yeah. Right? And then you're done. And so and I don't feel like there's nuggets of gold if you keep digging. If you keep digging, you're just going to get the same idea.
Yeah. This is fair. So I think that all these authors are getting at two different things. So one question is, how does the canon come to exist? And that's the history of greatness joining itself to greatness, which is, I don't want to pretend, is an easy process. And even those saying that sentence, like it kind of shouldn't make any sense. But we do receive that, and we can read what those before us have said. This is great. I think an especially easy way to do this is to look at who references what. So when you're reading something, what are they referencing? Who are they reading? And that's some indication of who great thinkers, great authors are reading before them. So it's much easier to trace the canon from present day to past than it is to, in the moment, recognize greatness. And that's, I think, the problem with Eliot's quote, is to say it's really hard to know who today are the great poets of 100 years from now.
Yeah.
Who's going to be remembered? What authors are going to be remembered 100 years from now? And so that's why I disagree with Eliot's
There's probably
position.
like a shoebox somewhere filled with amazing poetry that we won't discover. Like a kid's still writing it, and we're going to discover it when he's dead, and we're going to be like, oh my goodness, this is.
And we won't know
epic.
until later. And that's it's funny that AJ's example was The Shawshank Redemption, because when it first came out, it failed at the box office. It was a flop when it came out, but now, if I'm not mistaken, I could look this up, but I'm not going to. I think it's the number one movie on IMDb, like most highly regarded movie on IMDb.
It deserves it.
Yes, but at the time was not recognized that way. I would not put Thoreau in the same category, but I liked him as a high schooler, but probably wouldn't like him now. Walden did not sell well in his life. There were like tons of copies of it made because he thought it was going to be great. They didn't sell. He died, and then it became popular after he died. To recognize greatness in our day is very hard, and I think probably not worth our doing. But the tradition that comes before us is more trustworthy, more established. Is that a fair place to get to with this? Mm-hmm. Okay. So you're going to think this is taking a weird turn, but it's not. So any other comments before I move on?
No, you're driving the van, maybe.
Okay. So that was Harold Bloom. So we've gone from Lewis, or I guess Eliot, to Lewis, to Tolstoy, to Harold Bloom. Now, just for kicks and giggles, let's read from Alan Bloom. So this is The Closing of the American Mind. I promise I'm citing the right people this time. There's something in Lewis's argument that I am questioning the value of critics in reading Lewis's second chapter. And I think there is something to the fact that Lewis, it matters that Tolstoy actually wrote good books and then wrote an essay on what is art. And even if we disagree with him, we should give it more credibility because he actually achieved the thing that he set out to describe.
So if he's claiming an organizing principle about art,
and he did,
and then he has created really good art, you should say, okay, well, we can't just throw him out. That if someone who claims an organizing principle about art and makes like really bad art,
then
we can be like, that person maybe doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yes. So then this is So this is Alan Bloom's quote on that.
Well, crap. Well, maybe Eliot's right because
See,
Lewis wrote good books.
Watch us go full circle. This is so good. The scholar cannot understand the text that he purports to interpret. Schiller might be able to grasp the essence of the Iliad because as a creator, he is akin to Homer. He could not understand Homer as Homer understood himself because his mind was of a different historical epoch. But he could understand what it meant to be a poet. A scholar can do neither. And when I'm reading scholar, I'm thinking critic in the same way, but maybe that's unfair. A scholar can do neither. From the point of view of life and from the point of view of truth, modern scholarship is a failure. Hegel ridicules the typical German gymnasium teacher who explains that Alexander the Great had a pathological love of power. The teacher proves the assertion by the fact that Alexander conquered the world. The teacher's freedom from this illness is attested to by the fact that he has not conquered the world. The story encapsulates Nietzsche's criticism of the German university and its classical scholarship. The scholar cannot understand the will to power, not a cause recognized by science which made Alexander different from others, because the scholar neither has it, nor does his method permit him to have it or see it. The scholar could never conquer the mind of man.
Clearly, as teachers, we have conquered the love of money.
There it is. So you can teach on that. So that's why Great Expectations is actually the perfect book for you to teach, isn't that? I guess I'll lay that quote out there.
Teach about obsession because you're apathetic? Is that kind of the...
Well, crap, now I feel like the only way we can keep being teachers of high quality is we need to start, writing books.
Cranking out classics.
Cranking out classics, like writing poetry. And,
I think you're right.
And writing novels and stuff.
I think you're right.
Oh, man.
So I'm sorry that the bar has been raised. But, so, the scholar is insufficient. He's talking about scholar. I'm hearing critic. But I'm also hearing... I like to listen to lots of podcasts at 2 times speed, and a number of those podcasts are political podcasts. And what I'm also hearing in this is I'm listening to people who are interpreting events that they're not a part of.
Yeah.
And so why do I care? Why am I wasting my time listening to people
who
pontificate?
Aren't in the game?
Aren't actually in the game. Why not listen to, first off, anyway, this is where I'm thinking it's a weird turn because I think it makes me, we should talk about our podcast a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, I was like, you do realize.
We kind of do this. But we should talk about
who we are.
I guess we should talk about that. Anyway, so that's where I'll lay that quote out there. Give me some thoughts. What do you think?
Well, my first thought is anybody listening to us at 2 times speed?
That's what I do. Am I doing it wrong?
Because if you are...
Good.
That sounded really normal.
Yeah.
That was your first thought? I can do this crazy voice thing?
Yeah.
By the way, have we ever talked about how you should try listening to us at half speed because it's the funniest thing you've ever listened to?
Because it sounds like we're drunk off our tree.
Yeah, exactly.
It does. But okay, back to this. So, the world and the internet is filled with armchair critics.
Yes. Who aren't actually
in the game.
Yeah.
And we are chief among them.
You think so?
Well, we're doing a podcast on classical stuff. But like I said in the intro, we are not trying to resurrect some sort of golden age of education.
Yes.
But we are trying to seek out the timeless things of the things that, because they're timeless, have survived for centuries and are actually useful in the forming of taking young barbarian children and turning them into civilized human beings.
Yes. Sorry.
So...
But also,
so in that sense, it's what all people should be doing.
Yes.
And you don't have to be a writer of classics in order to be a man.
Yeah, I still kind of call hogwash and that no non-writer can judge whether a work is good or powerful.
Okay.
How would I ever recommend a book? I still fall into Lewis's logical problem, right?
That's fine.
How would I know what movies to go see? Apparently, I'm not a good enough critic to know which one is good, so I should ask someone else. But how do I know that they know what's good, especially if they're not an actual filmmaker?
No, I think it's different. I think it's totally okay to question the validity of film critics because you can go and experience that movie yourself. You can read the book yourself. Well,
but then how do I trust my own judgment of it?
You should be critical of your own judgment.
Well, it comes back to how does taste get developed?
Yes.
So maybe when you were of legal drinking age, you probably had beer for the first time.
Yeah, I did. I hated it. It was the worst.
And you probably didn't like it. I remember when I was young, and so my dad has a glass of scotch at the end of most work days, a glass of scotch and a bowl of corn chips. And I remember being young and trying scotch. I'm like, oh my goodness, this could take paint off the wall. This is disgusting.
Yeah.
And same thing with coffee. I remember drinking coffee, and of course, like all 15-year-olds drinking coffee for the first time, you load it with cream and sugar. So you drink like creamy sugar
Not really
with
coffee.
a little bit of coffee.
Yeah.
But now I drink coffee like black as death and thick as oil, and I love it. So
You've made it.
So I guess the question is, it just comes down to like, how do tastes get developed? Well, they get developed by somebody either telling you that something is good, or you have some sort of internal drive to say, everybody says that this is good and I don't like it.
Yep.
You're at a very dangerous place in your development. One path you can go down is, screw everybody, I'm just going to go after what I like. And you're probably just going to end up with like shallow, easy things. Or you can say, there's probably something wrong with me and my taste. I am going to either pretend I like it, which is, I think, another bad way to go about, because then you're just like emperors wearing no clothes eventually. Like someone could give you spoiled wine, you'd be like, oh, this wine's
So
delicious.
good.
Like my mojito story.
Yeah.
And then the other way is to say, I want to figure out why people who say that this is good, and I don't yet know why this is good, I want to figure out what they've got. And so you work at it, and you work at it until you honestly think the thing is good. So for example, like I now honestly think Milton is great. And I think probably the first time I read it, I was like, this is just old stuffy English that's hard to understand, and the only reason people like it is because of reputation. But now when I read it, I'm like, there are some passages that are just so delightful to read out loud that I am happy that I get to teach in my English class 3 times in one day, so that I get to read that passage aloud 3 times in a day and see the kids' reactions to it, right? So in some sense, the very fact that I've had to teach it, 3 times a day, every day for 7 years in 6 weeks a year, like how many times have I gone through Milton? A lot. I've now developed a taste for it. So I think it's just like, this is kind of what these people are saying. Like, one person's saying, well, only people with taste can tell you something's good. And other people are saying, like, no, people who don't have taste can tell you it's good. They just need to work at getting taste. I don't know. I just sort of feel like it's a developmental thing as opposed to a...
So I'm trying to think through the criteria of what it should be, right? I'm uncomfortable with Eliot's notion that only
Contemporary
poets can be the ones who can criticize a thing. So I think because it's not true, right? I can put a piece of bad writing and a piece of good writing next to each other on the board for my 9th graders, and my 9th graders can easily recognize which is better, right? At least most of the time. And so there's got to be something in...
Unless they're trying to be punks. Unless they're being like, this is just my opinion. I really feel like the one on the left is better than the one on the right.
I've had that where they're trying to be punks, but honestly, they can sit down and they can usually recognize the better one, which means it's not just professional poets that can recognize good art. There's something else there.
But what if the more complicated one is when you put side by side lyrics from songs? Because I hope all of you have had a student walk up to you and say, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life, and it's a top 40 song, and you're like, oh buddy. And you put that next to Milton.
You can distill all top 40 songs nowadays into, I'm great. No one realizes it. One day they will.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's
yeah.
unfair, because songs are a completely different art form than Milton, right? It's a different party. If you put, say, a recent pop song against some of the best Queen songs, there you go, and the kid is like, you're right, Bohemian Rhapsody is way better than whatever trash I'm listening to, right? So that's
but not
a different
everyone
experience.
realizes that.
So I think there's a certain level on which experience of the art to a certain degree, or Graham, I think you'd call it development of taste, right? What you need is the more breadth of a thing you have experienced, then the more qualified you are as a critic. So as a soldier, right, I can tell you what sword's a good sword because I've probably used a bunch of different swords. A kid that picks up a sword for the first time has no idea. He has no breadth of experience or taste. The person who can best tell you what swords are good is a smith. Right? Yeah. That's the person who knows the best. In fact, maybe not always. Maybe he's making what he thinks is good, but he's never actually used them in the field, and so they crack.
Sure, right? This is great. Yes, exactly.
And so I think as a person who experiences sunsets, I will be able to tell you which sunsets are the best ones.
Yes.
Right? But I can never tell you to the degree that God can, the creator of the sunsets. He can say, this is the best one, and look what I've done.
Yeah.
Right?
That's why I'm agreeing with that almost. I think, I'm agreeing with that of the scholar has a skill, but that skill is not getting in the mind of Alexander the Great or understanding conquest of men's minds. That's what Alan Bloom is talking about.
Yeah, who's going to understand Milton more? The poet who just writes poetry, or the person who has tried, like either in the political sphere or in a company or something, who's tried to create a environment for everyone's health and is betrayed.
Yes.
Like that person, when he reads Milton's Paradise Lost, he is going to understand the fury one should have at Satan, who is, because of his pride, is trying to destroy something that is actively good.
Yeah.
So if you're like, for example, if we have a school and we are trying to create something actively good, and then there's an undermining force that wants to undermine it because of, there's nothing going on at the school. I'm just using this as an example because it's our sphere.
Right.
If someone's, because of pride or arrogance or just hatred of the good is trying to undermine something, like Milton can help us understand that situation.
Yes.
We don't have to be a poet, but we can experience, but we're experiencing what's happening what this epic is talking about. We're experiencing it in our own small microcosmic school way, but it can help inform what noble, good, righteous behavior should be.
Yes.
I think that's akin to your using the sword in the field as opposed to using the sword in the shop.
I actually think a breadth of experience or development of taste is probably more important than, if we're talking contemporary poets, I can be a really good contemporary poet and having never read anything before my birth. And then when I, for the first time, read Milton, I will say, what is this trash? It doesn't make any sense. I can't make heads or tails of it.
It would be better without capital letters.
It would be better without capital letters. And can we get some free prose in here? Like geez, what's with all these like rigid line breaks and rhyme schemes?
Yeah.
Like, I would react in revulsion to that. And in fact, my lack of breadth of experience would hinder me recognizing it.
Yeah.
But I do think there is something to be said for the experience of crafting it yourself.
Yes.
Right? It does change your breadth of experience, right? I think that's just one factor in many, and that's why some writers, and I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis here, are incredible because he has that skill of making it, right? He has written some incredible books. At the same time, I know Lewis has a breadth and depth of experience of ancient and contemporary poetry.
Yep.
He has read everything from Homer to Beowulf and everything in between, and in fact written a lot of decent criticism of those books. And so his breadth of experience is supplemented by his creation experience.
Yes.
But I don't think your business as a creator qualifies you necessarily to comment on the worth of the thing. Like I think the soldier has something to bring that the smith doesn't necessarily know as far as the usefulness of swords.
But then so does the smith to the...
So does the smith. And so the best would be a soldier smith.
Yes.
Right? He's the guy you want to go to, the guy who makes his own swords and then has to use them in the field. In fact, I would go to no other smith.
This is good. I like all this. So I guess where we landed is that essentially it's some piece of all of these answers. So I would say that there is validity to Tolstoy's point that if you're reading a book and it's not impacting you in any way, either you're not ready for the book, which is what was true of me, or it could just be a bad book. And it's okay to say that and acknowledge that.
Oh, they're out there.
Yeah, of course they're out there.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a lot... I like T.S. Eliot's position the least of all of them, AJ, for the reasons you're saying, that I think limiting it to contemporary poets doesn't really make a lot of sense. But to Harold Bloom's point of greatness being the only thing that can join itself to greatness, I think what gives us the ability to talk here about classical education is that, listener, you might not know, AJ and Graham have both received the Best Teacher Award for Veritas Academy. Was it multiple times?
You can't.
Oh,
you
only
can
one time.
win it
There it
once.
is. Okay, cool.
You get it once, and then I think there's a 3 or 4 year break in between.
So, listener, what you're listening to are excellent classical educators who are talking on this podcast, which is what gives us some ability to talk about classical education, the theme of this podcast. Does that make sense? There's excellence that you all have that we're able to talk about here. But I guess all of us are lay,
shucks. Go on.
All of us, yeah, exactly. And ultimately, all of us are lay people. But there's also the hope of like these books that we read are accessible, and we hope what we point you to are the books themselves. I do, in fact, hope you will pick up the preface to Paradise Lost. I hope you will read Paradise Lost.
You should read the preface before you read Paradise Lost.
Good to know.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think jumping right in, you're gonna
I think
have trouble.
My final thought on Eliot versus Lewis is the reason why Eliot kind of puts me off and Lewis doesn't is that Eliot went about his act of creating poetry in a somewhat like arrogant,
Yes.
poets are so important kind of way. Like I imagine he like wore capes and grumbled through London. And like, when someone was like, how are you doing today, Mr. Elliot? He would be like, the winds have howled. And you're like, oh my goodness, just dude, like, how are you doing? Just talk to me. And he sort of takes himself too seriously. Whereas
he's the kind of guy that gets poet tattooed on his arm.
Yeah, totally. Whereas you get the sense that Lewis looks at his writing and his creative output as just a normal output of an ordinary person's life. Like he was writing little kid stories when he was a little kid, and he's writing little kid stories because he enjoys it as an old man, as a man.
Right.
But he doesn't say that this is all in all super important. And Eliot says only poets can understand poets, and you're just like, get over yourself.
I think more importantly, Lewis had humility.
That's what I'm getting at.
There were some things he wrote that failed, and he knew they failed, and I think. You can write whatever you want to write, but if at the end of the day you have to sit at the feet of Milton,
yes,
you recognize the literary worth of your
You should approach
output.
every book that is considered that has a reputation of having some kind of level of like respect about it, and you should approach that thing humbly and diligently try to mine the gold out of it. And if at the end you have not found any gold, the first thing you should say is there's probably something wrong with me. Mm-hmm. And it should be after many times that you say, no, this book has nothing in it.
That's fair. And just, you're saying this, but so yes, there's a universality, but also we should be pursuing greatness in whatever our thing is that's what gives us an authority to talk about any subject.
Yes.
So pursue excellence, pursue deep reading, pursue whatever your craft is, go after it full force. So it's both of those. Yeah. And that's all I have.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I still have more thoughts about what Hannenberg and I disagree on, but
we'll probably come back to it with
I'm
the
sure.
T.S. Eliot episode.
Hannenberg and I will be hashing this out until we're like sweaty toothed old men.
I was going to say, I don't think you all are going to resolve this one.
Yeah.
So.
Nope.
All right, Graham.
Well, this has been Classical Stuff You Should Know. Oh, we've got a couple of classical things we got wrong, and I will go through them very quickly. One, last podcast of Plantagenet, part 5. The town in France I could not pronounce that I thought was Rheims or Reims.
Like of paper.
Is apparently Reims. With an M.
Cool. So I have no reaction. Sorry.
I don't know how the French can ignore so many consonants.
I know.
Yeah,
so Reims. Anyway, so there you go. Cool. And then another classical thing we got wrong was I said that St. Valentine was the missionary to the Irish, and because it's St. Patrick's Day on Sunday, I should point out that is definitely wrong. And it was St. Patrick who was the missionary to the Irish. St. Valentine was someone in Rome that got his hands chopped off or something. So those are two classical things I got wrong. If you want to email us at classicalstuff@veritasacademy.net, if you have a great definition of art or want to weigh in on the great Hennenbergian Donaldsonian debate, you can. If you want to tweet us at classicalstuff, you may do so. CLSSCAL stuff.
Still going to try to do a hostile takeover of classical stuff.
I feel like it's manifest destiny that classical stuff should be
ours.
ours.
The guy hasn't tweeted in forever.
And we will like and retweet and talk to your things. And you can find us at classicalstuff.net and look at pictures. And yeah, we're working on some things in the background, maybe even like a comment section on classical stuff, so we can maybe get some conversations going on specific episodes. But thank you, listener, for listening to us. We appreciate you and enjoy your spring break.
Bye.
Bye.